Yeah, so I'm going to try to go through some of this again. I think okay. Shira, if it's okay, I'm going to read from what you wrote, and we'll go from there. What I want to say before we get back into this, since we did look at this sugya last week, even though I was planning to go on now, but since you asked some pertinent questions, I thought better to do them now while they're still fresh in our mind. And like I say, eventually we're going to go and look at a lot of other things about the clothing. And then, as I said, I think last week, I wanted to go back a little bit earlier in the chapter and start to examine the vidui. But we're going, I think the time we're going to take on the vidui, it's going to be at least a couple of shiurim, maybe more, because there's really quite a lot. And I want to do the sugya here in Yoma, and I want to go back and look at the references in Tanakh that the sugya brings. So there's a lot to do there. But in the meantime, let's look here. Let me make sure I can share my screen. Hold on a second. Yeah. Lately, I've been having Zoom issues. I think they changed it a little bit, and I got a little confused, but it seems to be working okay now. I just want to say, by way of introduction, I also over the weekend, over Shabbat, I was looking at the Perush of Rabbeinu Hananel on this sugya, and he understands it very, very differently than Rashi. So I don't know if we'll have time to look at that as well, but it's quite interesting. So Shira wrote me several questions. I'm going to read it. I want to make sure I understand the question. So Shira, you'll help me, and then we'll look. So Shira, you wrote on the problem of prefixing a legitimizing sign in the event of a high priest being replaced, having become tameh after the tamid sacrifice. Okay, so that's like the basic introduction to this machloket between Ravada Bar Ava and Rav Huna and Rav Papa. Just a second. Turn that off. Oh, and here's Paul. See that? Ravada Bar Ava is in the quote comfortable position that the only clothing that only the clothing is sufficient as a legitimizing sign, which is the pure white belt. And I will just add in now, that's according to the way Rashi understands the sugya, which is the way we learned it. While the opposing side must appeal to something else, since the white clothing makes the new high priest, according to the assumption of the opposing side, that the simple priest wears a pure white belt every day, precisely confusable with the Kohen Hedyot. Now Rav Huna brings in as a sign in action in combination with clothes. And you had asked, if I remembered, understood it right, how one could justify this sufficiently. I'm not sure if I said justify it, but say there. What would be the alternative to this? Could we, for example, only refer to a change of clothing from the 8-piece robe to the 4-piece white robe in other words, the kutone, actually it would be, some of the other clothing, on an identical person, thus legitimizing it? Would such a change of clothes be allowed at all, provided that it was accompanied without a purpose of an avodah, or would such a change of clothing possibly be compared or paralleled to the forbidden biare kanit, entering the temple without purpose? If that were the case, then one would have to combine an action, which is not necessary as in our case, but would be permitted nevertheless, the turning of the Tamid offerings, and which may be accomplished again only in the 8-part high priest garb. So, in trying to understand exactly what you're asking, so you're posing, first of all, you raise an interesting question, which is, is it permissible for the Kohen Gadol to wear his clothing stam, even if he's not doing an avodah? And as far as I can tell, yes. And this idea that it would be like coming into the temple without any purpose, I didn't thoroughly research this, but it seems to be that it's not. And also, we learned ourselves back in Tamid that the Kohen Gadol was allowed to go into the Heichal stam. He was the only Kohen who's allowed to do that, right? We learned it, it's in the last chapter of Tamid, that if he wanted to, he could go in. And remember, he was accompanied by 2 other Kohanim, and he would go in and he would bow down. So I don't think that there's anything inherently problematic with the Kohen Gadol putting on the priestly garments, putting on the Shmoneh Begadim, as it were, stam. But having read what you wrote, I'm not sure that if I understood if there was an additional question besides that. What more were you trying to ask here?
Yeah, thank you. So I remember in Mishnah Tamid, there was a purpose to pray, to Nishtachavut. So he combined the coming with something not necessary, it seems not a part of the Avodah, but it's, if we want to free will to pray, he is allowed. And this seems a little bit different, this case. And I'm not sure about this parallelism about Bia Rekanit, but it seems so to change clothes on the identical person to only to legitimate or to demonstrate that he is allowed to begin to start the Avodot related to the Yom Kippur. So I'm also not so sure about my question, but it seems to be your question. What could we think about the alternative other than action? So that was the trace brings up my question. So okay, first, what is about the prayer? The praying in Tamid in the last chapter, I remember very well, and I guess that everybody remembers this case coming in the Hechal, even the Hechal, not only in the Lam or before the Mizbeach, before, but even with the Hechal and doing something permitted. So we have an action, we have an deed, we have he performs or he is a prayer. He comes and do something in the sense of praying or adoring or so.
So I think you make that in terms of that, you make a good point. So here I brought up the Mishnah. Does everybody see that? The Mishnah? Or is it not being shared? Hold on a second. I have this question of what everybody sees. Hold on a second.
I see it.
You do see it. It's on the screen. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so let's just remind ourselves, it says Bizman. So the Mishnah here, if you remember, this is after, it's being brought up after the previous chapter where we talked about the Ktoret, which was more or less the last thing that we talk about in terms of the Seder of the morning. And then it says after that, Bizman shekohen gadol nichnas lihishtachavot. At the time the Kohen Gadol goes in, as you say, it goes into the Heichal to bow down. And the Bartanur explained, Bahechal, he goes into the Hechal to bow down. V'lo mikaria v'yal shelo l'tzorech. This is not called coming into the Hechal for for an unnecessary reason. So that was something that was particular to the Kohen Gadol, that he was allowed to go into the Hechal, but as you say, he goes in to bow down. So he's not doing a specific avodah. What he's doing by bowing down is not technically avodah, but it's something that he's allowed to do. And we may come back and talk about this separately, this whole question of him going into the Hechal to bow down, because of course we understand from the beginning of Parshat Achrei Mot, it says, Al Yavo B'chol Eit Al HaKodesh Mi Beit LaParochet, and so forth, which in Pshuto Shel Mikra would indicate he can't, this is not something that it should be done at any time, it should be done in a specific way. But at least for this point, right, to go into the Hechal, we understand that this is something he was allowed to do. So in terms of what we were concerned about, what we were concerned about here is, so as you put it, what is going to be the thing that is going to legitimize this new Kohen Gadol, who is going to be taking over as Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, after the Tamid Shachar has already been done. So what will legitimize him? So when we started off with, so the first answer was Ravada Barava. I think at this point it's going to help us now, because we didn't have time to do this last week. Now let's go through Rashi and see how Rashi understands all of these things, because I won't read your other questions yet, but we'll come back to them. But I think at least one of your questions is going to be answered by a more careful reading of Rashi. So let's just remind ourselves, Matkinin lo kohen acher, right? So that's the quote from the Mishnah that we prepare, or we fix for him another kohen, right? So we make an understudy for the Kohen Gadol, right? Lest he become pasul to do the avodah. So the Gemara on this asks the question, Pshita, it's obvious, Ira bo psul kodem tamid shel shachar, v'chanchin oto b'tamid shel shachar. If a psul befell the Kohen Gadol before the tamid shel shachar was brought, then we'll be mechanech the new Kohen Gadol by having him do the service of the tamid shel shachar. And so now we'll also just remind ourselves, and we'll see, Rashi also alludes to this, that when he's doing the Tamid Shel Shachar, he will be wearing the Shmona Begadim. He'll be wearing the regular 8 clothes that the Kohen Gadol wears every day. And so it's going to be obvious that he has now become Kohen Gadol. And by the way that the question is posed, Mechanchin b'tamid shel shachar, it seems the emphasis is on the fact that he's going to be doing this avodah. But we also know he'll be doing that avodah in those clothes. So it's not clear from the way the question is posed, makoveya, right? What's the thing that's mechanechoto? Is it the fact that he's doing tamid shel shachar? Or is it the fact that he's wearing the shmoneh begadim? Or maybe you cannot extricate one from the other. Maybe those two things have to go hand in hand. Ela yirabo psul achar tamid shel shachar. But what happens if the psul befell the first Kohen Gadol after he completed the avodah of the tamid shel shachar? How are we going to be mechanech, how we now dedicate or invest the new Kohen Gadol? Amar Ravada Barava Avnet. So Ravada Barava says with the belt, and he doesn't mention any avodah. And an indication is that merely by wearing the belt, that will be enough to be mechanech oto. So let's see how Rashi understood all this. Pshita ira, b'kohen gadol psul b'yom kippurim kodem tamid shachar. So it's obvious that if it befell the kohen gadol a psul on Yom Kippur, before the tamid shachar was brought, mechanechin oto lezeh hameshamesh tachtav b'tamid shachar. So we will now be mechanech, the new understudy, who's now going to be the Kohen Gadol in his place, by doing the avodah of the Tamid Shel Shachar, she'asuhu Tamid Shel Shachar b'shmoneh begadim, so that he will do the Tamid Shel Shachar wearing the 8 pieces of clothing that's particular to the Kohen Gadol. Yehem mechunach l'chuna gedola kodem sheyagia avodat Yom HaKippurim. And he will thereby be invested as the Kohen Gadol, as the high priest, before the time comes to do the avodah of Yom Kippur. But if the psul befell the Kohen Gadol, the first Kohen Gadol after the Tamid Shel Shachar, so then b'meh mechanechin oto, how will we be mechanech the second Kohen Gadol? Harei avodat Yom Kippurim shachar hatamid ba'arba'a begadim hi, because we behold the service of Yom Kippur that's done after the Tamid Shel Shachar is going to be done with the 4 pieces of clothing that are particular to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. How is it recognized that he was ever a Kohen Gadol? How did he leave his status of being an ordinary Kohen? Kohen Gadol, so in order that the service now for Yom Kippur is going to be done by a high priest. So Rav Ada bar Ava says Bavneit. So he says Bavneit, Botan arba'a begadim atzman yeshaker lekuhuna gedola. With those 4 particular pieces of clothing, there is a recognizable factor. It's recognizable that he is now he has assumed the high priesthood. Shavneto shel Kohen Gadol ba'avodat Yom Kippurim shel botzu. Right, so his avnet is of fine linen, kedichtiv u'bavneit bad yachgor, as we saw in Parshat Achrei Mod. It says explicitly he has to wear an avneit bad, which is both, which is fine linen. V'zeh arachshav hayaragil la'avod b'shel kilai. And this Kohen, until now, was accustomed to wearing an avnet that was of kilayim, right? It was made from both linen and wool. So Rav Ada bar, so again, so how does Rav Ada bar Ava answer the question? Question was, b'meh mechanechin oto, how will we be mechanech oto? How will we, as according to Rashi, how will it be made known? How will it be recognizable that this person who just a moment ago was a Kohen Hediot, how will we know that right now he has become a Kohen Gadol? So what's his answer?
Avnet, the clothing.
The clothing. And how does that answer the question? How do we know that he's the Kohen Gadol now?
Because it's differentiated from when he was a Kohen Hediot.
Yeah. So he's wearing an avnet that only the Kohen Gadol wears. So Ravada, as Rashi already lets us in on this by saying that Ravada Barava understands, he already assumes that the Kohen Hedyot wore an avnet of kilayim. So this Kohen, who is like waiting in the wings to take the place of the Kohen Gadol just in case he is needed, until a moment ago would have been wearing the avnet of kilayim. Now, presumably, if he's now going to be installed as the new Kohen Gadol, he's going to change into the clothing that's specifically for Yom Kippur, which we learned earlier in the chapter was especially fine linen, right? It was worth it was worth a lot of money. It wasn't the same actually as the linen clothing that a regular Kohen wore, but it essentially, like for people who are looking on, it looks the same. But now he's going to be wearing a special avnet. Everyone's going to see that he's wearing a white avnet, and Shalom al Yisrael. Now we know he's the Kohen Gadol. So like we said last time, at this point in the Gemara, and it was you see also from Rashi, the chinuch is simply the change of clothing. That's sufficient to do the chinuch. So bearing in mind that just a moment ago, the Gemara asked that in the case that he was going to be mechunach before the Tamid Shel Shachar, he would be, the Gemara said, he would be mechunach by doing the avodah of the Tamid Shel Shachar. He was going, right, that would be the chinuch, he would, by doing the avodah. But Rashi added in that when he would do the Tamid Shel Shachar, he would have done it b'shmona begadim. So Rashi points that out. Now that might be obvious, but here it seems especially important to point it out because Rashi may be indicating that the chinuch was not so much that he did the avodah, but it was that he had the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. Right, so when we were learning it a moment ago, it's not clear from the Gemara. There are two aspects to that. There's the clothing, and there's the avodah. The clothing is significant because it's actually, even though we learned in Tamid, right, that the Kohen, we learned it also here in Yoma, the Kohen Gadol, if he wanted to, on any given day, could just do all of the avodah of the Korban Tamid. And in fact, during the week leading up to Yom Kippur, we also learned that in order to get him ready for Yom Kippur, he would do that. He would do the avodah of the Tamid, and of course, when he was doing the avodah of the Tamid on any day, including Yom Kippur, he'd be wearing shmona begadim. Okay, so even at this point, it's not exactly clear, but Rashi seems to be leaning at this moment, at least to lead us up to understand Ravada Barava. How does Ravada Barava answer the question? He doesn't talk anything about avodah. He only talks about the avnet. So Rashi's already indicated to us that, but the Seder, that's sufficient. That the real way that the chinuch took place in the case of the Kohen Gadol who had to take over in order to do the Tamid Shel Shachar, the chinuch per se was actually that he wore the shmona begadim, and that's the point. That would be the point of the question. That is, in the case where he has to do the Tamid Shel Shachar, the chinuch will the heker. Right, Rashi associates heker with chinuch. That is, the chinuch in this context means, how will it be noted? How will it be recognized that he is now the Kohen Gadol? So the way it's going to be recognized is because everybody will see that when he did the Tamid Shel Shachar, he was wearing shmona begadim. And so if he has to be mechunach acharei tamid shel shachar. So then he'll be recognized because now he's going to be wearing the avneit of boats. And that's sufficient. So the Gemara continues, says, Han nicha lamanda amar avneito shel kohen gadol, zehu avneito shel kohen hediot. Rashi explains, so this goes well. Han nicha lamanda amar avneito shel kohen gadol. That is, Rav Ada bar Ava's answer is fine, according to the opinion, the avneit of the kohen gadol shel kol yemot hashana, that his daily belt, Haya shel kilayim. Kedichtiv v'etavneit shesh mashzar utachele. Right? It describes, back in Shmot, it describes the avneit of the Kohen Gadol. It was shesh mashzar utachele. So it was made of both linen, the shesh mashzar, and the tchelet, which would be wool. Zehu avneito shel kohen hediot. That belt that is described as being the belt of the Kohen Gadol all the other days of the year is the same belt that the Kohen Hediot also wore. Shein chiluk ba'avnetehem. There was no difference between their belts. Ika hekera b'yom kippurim ba'avnet. So according now to this opinion of Rav Ada bar Ava, if he's relying on the opinion that there was no difference between the avneit of the Kohen Hediot and the avneit of the Kohen Gadol all the other days of the year. So now, Ika Hekera b'Yom HaKippurim ba'avneit. So now there will be something recognizably different on Yom Kippur with the avneit. Lefisha avneito shel Kohen Gadol mishtaneh b'Yom HaKippurim liyot shel bots. Okay, because now the Kohen Gadol is going to have a different belt, and it's going to be of boats. And as we understand, again, only the Kohen. So it turns out, according to this opinion, there's only one person who wears an avneit in the Beit HaMikdash that is of boats, and it's only the Kohen Gadol, and it's only on Yom Kippur, because every other Kohen is always going to be wearing a belt of kilayim. And in terms of heker, it's easily recognizable, right? It's this very colorful belt. You'll see it from a distance. It doesn't look like a white belt. So this is all well and good for Rav Ada bar Ava. So what Rav bar Ava says goes well, according to the one who holds the opinion that only the Kohen Gadol wore the avneit of boats on Yom Kippur. Elo the man damar avneito shel Kohen Gadol lo zehu avneito shel Kohen Hediot. Ma'i k'lamemar. But according to the one who says, Rashi says, Elo man damar lekaman, as we will see later on, that's the machokas, that we'll see in the Braita. Avneito shel Kohen Gadol b'chol hashana lo zehu shel hediot, that the avneit of the Kohen Gadol throughout the year is not the same as the avneit of the Kohen Hediot. How are they different? Shahahediot shel bots, because the belt that the regular Kohen, the ordinary Kohen, wore throughout the year, in fact, was boats. It was a white belt of linen. Nimtzu avnetehem shavim b'yom kippurim, umay hekera kuhuna gedola ika lahai. So now, what is recognizable about this new Kohen who's trying to assume the high priesthood, if he's going to be wearing an avneit of boats? Nobody can tell. In other words, a moment ago, he was a Kohen Hediot. Now we want to make him a Kohen Gadol, but he steps out and he's wearing clothing that looks exactly like the clothing he wore a moment ago. So how will we know that he's a Kohen Gadol? So Amar Abaye lovesh shmone umapech b'tzinora. So Abaye says, yes, there's a different answer. In other words, Abaye wants to answer the question, according to the Manda Amar, according to the opinion that holds that the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot and the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim were the same. So according to that opinion, we can't use Ravada Baraba's answer that he was distinguished by the Avnet. He won't be distinguished by the Avnet. Nobody will see that he's the Kohen Gadol. So Marbaya Lovesh Shmona Mapech B'Tzinor, Rashi says, Kodem Shiatchil Avodat Hayom, Shehu B'Begadim Hashavim B'Hediot, Lovesh Shmona Begadim V'Yafoch B'Mizbeach B'Achitzon, Echad Me'avarei Tamid B'Mazreg Shabarzel D'Kiruv Avodah. Okay, so how will he be distinguished? He'll be distinguished that before, even though now the Tamid Shel Shachar is over, and even though now, if the regular Kohen, if the first Kohen Gadol had not been Nifsal, he would have taken off the Shmona Begadim and put on the white Begadim. But since we have to replace him with the new Kohen Gadol, and since the Tamid Shel Shachar was already brought, so before he begins Avodat Hayom meaning the Avodah that is specific to Yom Kippur, and those are going to be done in Begadim that are the same as the Kohen Hediot, or at least ostensibly the same. They look the same. So what will we do? We'll have him wear the Shmona Begadim, and he'll go up to the Mizbeach, outside Mizbeach, the Mizbeach HaNechoshet, and he'll take a big fork and turn over one of the burning pieces of flesh that's on the Mizbeach, because that's Kiruv Avodah. It's close to Avodah. And what makes it that? Rashi also still has to give a justification for it. He says, Shima Maher Ligitakel Mechamat Hafichazu, because now it will be consumed faster because of this turning over. So even though it wasn't a necessary avodah, but it's going to contribute to the burning of the tamid. So since it's going to contribute to the burning of the tamid, to use my own words, it's like a nispach, it's added on, but it's a legitimate part of the avodah. It's like an extension of the avodah. Rashi says it's kiruv avodah. It's close to avodah. Va'avodahi. And so for our purposes, it is avodah. And how do I know? K'derav Huna, which we'll say in a moment. V'nimtza shenitchanech l'huna gedola kodem l'chein. And so it will turn out that he will be mechunach as the high priest before that. Before what? What's the kodem l'chein?
Before turning over the limb on the outer Mizbeach.
No. Before what? Back to the beginning of Rashi. Amar Abai, Kodem Shiatchil Avodat Hayom.
For beginning the service of Yom Kippurim.
Right. So in other words, by doing
That's 4 piece.
Right.
Yeah.
So by wearing the Shmona Begadim and doing an avodah-like action, he will now be mechunach as the Kohen Gadol prior to doing the avodah of Yom Kippurim. That's the Kodem L'chein. So at this point, it would seem that we still have to understand this question. So what exactly was the chinuch? Was it the fact that he wore the Shmona Begadim, or was it the fact that he did this little bit of an avodah on the Mizbeach? What was the chinuch?
Combination that both wearing the 8 piece clothes of the Kohen Gadol and doing in these garments specifically this avodah only allowed to a Kohen, so the Tamid, or not, yeah, a part of a Tamid, offering, turning the parts, being a work not necessary but allowed, permissible. So, but both in these garments as a sign that he is the Kohen Gadol and perform a part of avodah of the Tamid. Yeah, only permissible for to do by a Kohen, not normally, daily, and in this case by the Kohen Gadol.
So now, though, I could say slightly differently and along the lines of what I understood to be your first question. I might argue that, in fact, the real chinuch was that he was wearing the Shmona Begadim. The reason he does this kiruv avodah, the reason he does the mapech b'tzinora, could be, in fact, based on, what you brought up as possibility. Maybe once he wears the clothes, he can't put them on for no reason. Maybe he can't put them on for no reason. So why is he mapech b'tzinora? Not to be mitchanech as the Kohen Gadol, but it's just something that he has to do now that he put on Shmona Begadim. He has to do it. And that would be the reason that Abaye says that he would be ma'apech b'tzinora on the one hand, and Rav Ada bar Rava said it's enough for him to put on the Avnet. In other words, Rav Ada bar Rava didn't say he had to do any particular avodah, but Rabbi says he does have to do something like an avodah. And it could be that the difference is actually simpler than what we had imagined from last week, which is, according to Rav Ada bar Rava, the reason he doesn't have to do any specific avodah is because he's about to do a specific avodah. He's about to do the avodah of Yom HaKippurim, and the chinuch is simply wearing the avnet. And now so Rashi, what we see is Rashi emphasizes that the whole idea of chinuch is hekera, right? It's that we want to make something recognizable to show that he is the Kohen Gadol. Rav Ada bar Rava says, we recognize he's the Kohen Gadol because he's going to wear clothing that is distinct, in particular to the Kohen Gadol. Abaye says actually the same thing. He's also going to wear clothing that is distinct to the Kohen Gadol, and that in itself is the chinuch. It's just that once he put that on, he has to do something there has to be a reason for him to put on the begadim. So turn around from what I said earlier, but based on in line with what you brought up in your question, I could also understand Abaye like that. In other words, in that both Abaye and Rav Ada bar Rava understand that chinuch is sufficient by change of clothes, by wearing the clothes of the Kohen Gadol. It's just that if you wear the Shmona Begadim and there's nothing else to do with the Shmona Begadim, I'll make up, not make up something, but I'll give you something to do with the Shmona Begadim, even if it's not required, but you'll be allowed to do it. So that could be now a slightly different way of understanding it than we did last time. And how do I know that this mapech b'tzinora is in fact something like, it would be considered like avodah for halachic purposes? Rav Huna, Damar Rav Huna, zar shehipech b'tzinora chayav mita. Right? So Rashi explains tzinora is a mazleg, and a zar, a non-kohen that goes up and moves around some of the limbs on the mizbeach is chayav mita mishum va'azar karev yumat, because the Torah says explicitly that a non-kohen who comes close to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash is chayav mita. Alma, so since he's chayav mita, it teaches us krovei avodah havi avodah, that things that are close to avodah, like churning over a piece of meat on the mizbeach, is considered to be avodah. It's sufficiently avodah that if a zar does it, he'll be chayav mitah, just like if he brought the korban to begin with, or just if he did any of the avodot that the kohen, that only a kohen could do. In other words, anything from shchita and on, right? Because a zar could do shchita, but once the shchita is done, everything else has to be done by a kohen. And so even if he comes after the korban tamid shel shachar, or the korban tamid shel ben arbaim is done, and he runs up onto the mizbech and turns over one of the pieces of meat, that's considered to be enough of an avodah that he'll be chayav mitah. So in this case, Ravada Barava and Abaye both really hold that the chinuch is the change of clothes. Now we have Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, avodato mechanchata. So now we see Rav Papa as being even more distinct than we saw last time. He says, it's the fact that he does the avodah of the Kohen Gadol, that is the chinuch. Rashi explains, avodato mechanchato, avodat Yoma Kippurim atzma, right? The avodah of Yom Kippurim itself, she'ina kshera ela b'kohen gadol, v'zeh ovda mechanchato l'kuhuna gdola. This, the fact that he works it, that he does the avodah, that's what is mechanechoto to be the Kohen Gadol. And what's the basis for Rav Papa? So, okay, so before we go on, so let's just understand. Rav Papa says avodato mechanchato. So until now, we understood that a Ravada Barava gave his answer based on the opinion that the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur was distinct from the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot all year round. Abaye gives an answer that's based on the other opinion, which is that the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur is the same as the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot all year round. What does Rav Papa think about the question of the Avnet? Can we see from Rav Papa that he would hold that the Avnet would be the same as the Kohen Hediot or different than the Kohen Hediot? Is there any indication from Rav Papa about that?
He doesn't say anything. He doesn't mention it.
He doesn't mention it, and it doesn't seem to be important to his shita, because according to him, this whole question of what Avneti were is not relevant. We know that, I'm sorry, let me just. Rav Papa doesn't address the machloket at all. In other words, Rav Papa's opinion is not dependent on which opinion you hold regarding the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot. It has nothing to do with it. Like Michael just said, because he says avodato mechanchato, it's the avodah that's mechanechoto, then it doesn't, in fact, it doesn't tell me anything about the machloket regarding the Avnet. And Rav Papa is brought here because, of course, this is the discussion. That's the question that the Gemara is still trying to answer. So he says, okay, when he does the avodah itself, that's what's mechanechota. So I think we mentioned last time, apparently according to Abaye and according to Ravada Barava, there has to be some legitimizing factor that takes place before the Kohen Gadol can do the avodah of the Kohen Gadol. And according to Rav Papa, that's not true. So what's the chidush of Rav Papa in regard to the Avnet? According to him, even if you say that the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is the same as the Avnet of the Kohen Hadyot all year round, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Because the moment he starts to do the avodah that's particular to Yom Kippur, that only the Kohen Gadol can do on Yom Kippur, that in and of itself is Mechanech Hotel. That's his chidush. So for Rav Papa, there is no hachra'ah, right? There's no it's not decisive in terms of the Avnei, but it does say that it doesn't matter. So he could agree with Rav Ada Barava's contention. I'm sorry, he could agree with Abaye's contention, right? That it's the same, but it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. So until now, we have this idea that according to Rav Ada Barav and according to Abaye, the chinuch is going to be accomplished by the particular clothing that the Kohen Gadol wears. According to Rav Papa, it's going to be accomplished by him actually doing avodah. So let's see. Let's just read a little bit more. Rav Papa Amar avodato mechanchato milo tanya. Did we not learn in a brayta? Kol hakelim shasam Hashem meshichatan mikadeshtan. All of the kelim that Moses made for the Mishkan, that anointing them was what sanctified them. In other words, what made them kelim klei sharet for the purpose of doing the service in the temple. So Moshe had to anoint all of the kelim, but after that time, if they introduced a new kli, all they had to do was use it for its intended purpose. Once you used it once for its intended purpose, then it would be a kli sharet. So Rav Papa says, Hachanami. So here also, avodato mechanchato. The same way that the avodah, this new Kohen Gadol, is that which is going to make him the Kohen Gadol. Rashi, avodato mechanchato, avodat Yom Kippurim atzma, right? The service that is particular for Yom Kippur itself, she'enak shera el b'Kohen Gadol, it's kosher only by a Kohen Gadol. V'ze'ovda mechanchato l'kehuna gadola. And this, when he does it, is going to mechanechato to be the Kohen Gadol. Meshichat, and by kelim it says meshichatan mikadeshtan. Kedichti b'midbar v'yimshachem v'yikadesh otam. Right, when it's describing in Bamidbar, when Moshe is doing the dedication of the Mishkan, it says there that he anointed them, and v'yikadesh otam. The understanding is he anointed them and he thereby sanctified them. Mikan be'elach lo nimshachu kelim chadashim shenasim sham. Afterwards, that didn't have to happen. Kedamrina b'Masechet Shavuot otam b'mishicha. I think I brought the Gemara here. Yeah. V'imshachem v'kadesh otam b'mishicha v'lo l'dorot b'mishicha. That's the diuk lashon. It says v'imshachem v'kadesh otam. He anointed them. So only they had to be anointed. And afterwards, in future generations, they did not have to be anointed. So what would make them kadosh? The mere fact of using them. I just want to put in brackets, partly so I'll remember myself. There's a sugya in Masechet Sanhedrin a very important sugya that deals with the question of what the Gemara there calls Hazmana Milta, or Hazmana Lav Milta. And what the Gemara is talking about, it is the first, it actually talks about a number of cases. The first case it brings up is the question of if somebody made tachrichin, right? If somebody made a shroud for the dead, so once it's put on, everybody agrees, once you put the shroud on the dead person, it's asur b'hana'ah. You're not allowed to derive any kind of benefit from it. Question is, what if you make a garment that you intend to use as a shroud? Are you allowed to derive benefit from it before it's used as a shroud? Do we say hazmana miltahi? Do we say the fact that you have intended, like you've appointed this shroud to be used for this purpose, even though you have not yet used it? Is that enough to make it, to give it the din of a shroud? Or hazmana lav miltahi? It doesn't actually take on that isur hana'ah until you actually use it. This has hashlachot for a lot of halachic purposes. It comes up in sofrut, in hilchot sofrut. Let's say if you, in terms of, let's say where you're making klaf. So when you make klaf, you have to say making it l'shem kedushat sefer Torah, l'shem kedushat tefillin, l'shem kedushat mezuzah. So that also that's a certain kind of hasmana, and is that relevant? How is it done, and so forth. It occurs to me that there's a relationship here with the kelim, and as a corollary to that would also be related to the question of this nu kohen gadol. Is if you say hasmana miltahi, why don't I just say that once I have said that this person is going to be the Kohen Gadol, that's enough, even if he has not yet done anything. But the whole sugya here goes like the other side of that, Hazmana Lav Miltehi. The fact that I was Mazmino to Liot Kohen Gadol, nobody says that that's sufficient. We don't have any opinion that says that's sufficient. Either he has to wear specific clothing or he has to do avodah. So he doesn't become Kohen Gadol merely by the fact that he was designated to be the Kohen Gadol. So this is, I'm putting this in brackets. It's something I need to think about and look into to see if anybody relates these two sugyot. So I hope that's okay that I mentioned it, but it just occurred to me now as we're going through this that it seems to be a very relevant question. Okay, but for our purposes, we don't have to say anything more about it than that. So we have these three opinions. We have Ravada Barava and we have Abaye, and we're going to put them to one side because we could understand the Gemara now as saying that Ravada Barava and Abaye both hold that the chinuch of the new Kohen Gadol is entirely dependent on him wearing clothing prior to doing any avodah. And it's just a question of which clothing he's going to wear that's going to distinguish him. And Rav Papa's on the other side. He says, no, clothing doesn't matter because as soon as he puts on the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, that's particularly Yom Kippur, which is our case, right? We're talking about the case of the Kohen Gadol who's now going to take over after Tamid Shel Shachar. So it's naturally he's going to put on the white clothing. And the fact that he's wearing this belt or that belt doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that he gets to work. Once he starts working, that's his chinuch. So now the Gemara says, Kiata Rav Dimi Amar, Avnei Shel Kohen Hedyot, Rabbi v'Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, Chad Amar Shel Kilayim, v'Chad Amar Shel Bots. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, he said that the Avneit of the Kohen Hedyot is the subject of a machloka between Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. One of whom says that the Avneit of the Kohen Hedyot was Kilayim, which would mean that it's like the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol. Excuse me. But he wears the Shmona Begadim. Echad Amar Shel both. One of them says it's like the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And so now, and if you had a chance to look at some of the things that Shira sent from Rav Hirsch, herein lies the basic question. That is the basis. It's the basis for a certain conceptual approach. When I understand, as we said last time, the Torah doesn't tell me explicitly what the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot is. We don't know what it is. We know only the Torah goes out of its way to tell us the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol when he wears the Shmona Begadim, and the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, and it doesn't say anything about the Kohen Hediot. So we have an interesting question: is the Kohen Hediot more in some what this piece of clothing, the Avnet, is going to make him like the Kohen Gadol. But the question is, like which Kohen Gadol? Like the Kohen Gadol of every day, or like the Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippur? So maybe I'll just leave that as a question for the moment, but it's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. And by the way, I don't know if any of you saw this, and I think we mentioned this briefly when we were talking last time. So the Kohen Gadol, one of the gadim he wears is the mitznefet, and the Kohen Hediot wears a mikba'at. So you might have also thought that why doesn't the Gemara say people will know that it's the Kohen Gadol because now he's wearing, like he comes out wearing a mitznefet, or not a mikba'at. But I think eventually we'll go into this a little bit more, even though the way the mitznefet looked and the way the mikba'at looked was not the same, but they were considered for not all intents and purposes, but for basic intents and purposes to be the same. So that's not a distinguishing factor, even though they're right. One's a mikba'at, so the Rambam understood that the mikba'at was like a short, sort of pointy hat, and the mitznefet is like a turban. It's wrapped from a very long cloth, so it would look distinct. But nobody thought to mention that this is another way of distinguishing him, distinguishing the new Kohen Gadol from his status as a Kohen Hediot, because he would have had to wear a different hat. Nobody, which of course it works out very well in our English metaphors, he's going to put on another hat. But now I'm wearing my Kohen Gadol hat. But yesh kan ktsat raya that there is no halachic distinction between the mitznefet and the mikba'at. There's no significant halachic distinction, and it also could be that there was, when Rashi talks about hekera, that it's distinct. The question is also, what does Rashi mean? So I've assumed until now that Rashi means that people looking are going to think based on what they see. And I think that is what Rashi is getting at. And it could be that even though the new Kohen Gadol is now going to be wearing a mitznefet and not a mikba'at, that's not really a significant hekera. It's not a significant distinction that people will be able to see, even though it'll look different, but it's also white. It's also of linen. So it's not going to look significantly different. Okay, so this is also something that sort of a sidebar, but I think worth pointing out. Okay, so Rav Dimi comes and he brings a tradition that there's a machloket between Rebbe and Rabbi Ozar and Rabbi Ozar, Rabbi Shimon. Rashi says Hachi Garsina. This is the way we learn. This is our textual version. Ki Ataravdim Yamar Avnei Tosha Kohen Hadiot Rabbi Yosab Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon V'chulei V'lo Garsinan B'Yom HaKippurim Tahaba Kohen Hadiot Ein Chiluk B'Yom HaKippurim L'Shar Yamim. Okay. Rashi, as we pointed out in previous shiurim, not infrequently changes the girsa or either chooses a girsa or changes a girsa that was in front of him. He doesn't always tell us what girsa he's correcting, but here he does. He goes out of his way to tell us what girsa he doesn't want us to use. So let's now think about the girsa that was in front of Rashi that he is changing. He says, "V'lo garsinin b'yom haKippurim." So where would this phrase b'yom haKippurim have gone? It would have gone like this: Kiata Ravdimi Amar Avnei Tosha Kohen Hediot Rabbi Yozer Avnei Tosha Kohen Hediot b'yom haKippurim. It would have gone here. That that when Avdimi came, he said, the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot on Yom HaKippurim. That was the subject of a machokas between Rebbe and Rebbe Yozar Rabbi Shimon. So Rashi says that's an incorrect girsa. Why? Dahaba Kohen Hediot ein chiluk b'Yom HaKippurim l'shar hayom. Right. So clearly, Rashi here has a very strong claim that that's an incorrect girsa. It's an incorrect. It was simply a mistake, because we have no indication anywhere that the avneit of the Kohen Hediot ever changes, not Yom Kippur and not any other day. Okay, we'll leave that at that. So Tistayem to Rebbe Huda Marshal Kilai. So let's conclude. All right, so either Rav Dimi or the people who were with him in the Beit Midrash, when they hear this tradition, they want to figure out who said what. As we said last time, because it's going to be halachically significant, especially which one Rebbe said, because they're going to hold halachas like Rebbe. So let's say that Rebbe is the one who holds that the avneit of the Kohen Hediot was Kilayim. Why? Because I have another braita. Ein bein Kohen Gadol Kohen Hediot ela avneit. There is no difference between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hediot except for the avneit divrei Rebbe. So how does that prove? How would that prove that Rebbe is the one who holds that the avneit of the Kohen Hediot is Kilayim? If he says there's no difference between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hediot except for the avneit.
It seems referring to Yom Kippurim, because we know there are so many differences between Kohen Hediot and Gadol. So only on Yom Kippur we have this criteria to differentiate between these two types of priests by the avneit. So it seems Rabbi referring to Yom Kippurim.
Yefeh, which the Gemara in fact is going to say in a moment, but that would seem to be the way we'd have to read it here. And Rabbi Yosar, Rabbi Shimon says, Af lo avneit. There is no difference between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hediot, not even the avneit. So the Gemara says, Eimat, when? In other words, when are they talking about in their machloket? I neima b'shar yomot hashana tuva ika. If you say that the basis of their machloket is talking about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hediot all the other years, all the other days of the year except for Yom Kippur, So there are many things that are different. Rashi, Eimat, Ilaim b'bishar yamot hashana shekohen gadol mishamesh b'shel kilayim. If you say that they're arguing about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, who does his service with an avnate that's made of kilayim, the ka'amar dechalukin ba'avnatehen, and now we're saying that they have a difference of opinion, or the chalukin ba'avnatehen, that they are different in their avnetim between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Yot, the Shahadyot debots, and you want to say that the avnate of the Kohen Hedyot was made of boats, then tuva ika. There are a lot of things that are different. Ela lav biyom haKippurim. Rather, no, it's talking about Yom HaKippurim. The Shel Kohen Gadol debots, Bashmein and the Shel Hedyot the Kilayim. So it's talking when Rebbe says there's no difference between the Kohen Gadol, and he's talking about the clothing that was particular to the Kohen Gadol for Yom Kippur, that was entirely of boats, and the clothing of the Kohen Hedyot every day, except for the Avnei, Bashmain and the Shel Hedyot the Kilayim. So now it tells me that the Avnei of the Kohen Hedyot was made of kilayim, because that's the only distinction, Rebbe says, between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hedyot. So when it says Ein bein Kohen Gadol Kohen Hedyot, we understand we have to fill in a lot of words. We have to say there's no difference between the white clothing, the linen clothing that the Kohen Gadol wears on Yom Kippur, and the linen clothing or the daily clothing of the ordinary Kohen, except that the avnate of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is also linen, and the avnate of the Kohen Hedyot is kilai. Right? And this din is going to apply to the Kohen Hedyot all the days of the year. And it's distinct now from the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur when he is wearing the white clothing. So at this point, just to take stock of where we are. So what were we trying to prove when we said tistayen?
We want to know which Tana holds like which, and in this case, the presumption is that Rebbe holds that it's Kalayim.
Yafeh. And so tistayem. So now at this point, I want to say, let's conclude that Rebbe is the one that holds it like kilayim, because this is how I understand to read these words. If I read these words as meaning that there's no difference between the clothing that's particular to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur and the clothing of the Kohen Hedyot every day of the year, except for the Avnei, according to Rebbe, so then I understand. What does it mean there's no difference except for the Avnei? Obviously, the one thing that we know for sure is that the Avnei of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur was boats. And so by default, it means that the Avnei of the Kohen Hedyot must have been kilayim. So the Gemara says, Amri, lo, no, I don't have to read the Braita that way. La'olam b'sh'ar yemot hashana, u'v'hanach deshavin. I can say the Braita is always, it's really always talking about not the specific clothing of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. It's really talking about all the days of the year. And it's talking about when it says there's no difference between, except, meaning there's no difference between the clothing that is otherwise the same, that are equal in all other respects. So Rashi says, the Kohen Gadol b'shel kilayim. again, the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol B'Shar Yomot Shana is Kilayim. That's for sure. That's Gzerata Katuv. The Torah tells us that. Bashmein Deshel Hadiot the boats. And so, according to this, now I'll say that Rebbe is coming to tell me Dafka Lahefech, the opposite, just the opposite. That there's no difference between the gadim, between the clothing of the Kohen Gadol throughout the year and the clothing of the Kohen Hadiot, except for the Avnet, that what? The Kohen Gadol wears an Avnet of Kilayim, and the Kohen Hadiot wears an Avnet of boats. So, punkt verkehrt. I've turned it on its head. I'm now going to say that no, actually tells me exactly the opposite of what you wanted to prove. Udaka Amart Tuvaika, and what you just said which would indicate I can't really read the Breita that way, because if you're talking about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol throughout the year, there are a lot of differences. Why would it couldn't possibly say that the only difference is Avnet, because Kohen Gadol has 4 other pieces of clothing that Ben Hayeter have gold, and only the Kohen Gadol gets to wear gold in the Beit HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, no, but I could still understand, because Vahanach de Shavim, Botam begadim sheshnehem shavim behem. It's only talking about the items of clothing that are comparable between them, which would be the Hainu K'tonot u'Michnasayim mitznefet v'avneit, ein beinehem el avneit. So regarding the shirt and the pants and the hat and the belt, there would be no difference according to this reading, according to Rebbe, except for the Avnei. So at this point, what have I accomplished? What was the Gemara trying to accomplish, and what did it accomplish by giving us this pshat?
Until now, it's not clear who is assume which position. It's not clear. So it's like you must go another way. You must bring another proofs. Not clear. So you can. It depends on, and then we can turn around and can assume also the opposite way to read the Baraita.
Okay, so we wanted to say Tistayem the Rebbe Huda Marshal Kilayim, and now at this point I can't say that. So as Shira just said, Hadrakushya Laduchta, right? The question's gone back to its original position. We're back at square one. I still don't know if Rebbe said this opinion or Rebbe said that opinion. Rebbe goes over, Shimon said this opinion, said that opinion. I don't know. So that's what I've accomplished. So at this point, when I read this Breita, I actually don't, it's not, the claim here when it says Amri, Lo Li'olam B'Shayimot HaShana V'Hanach T'Shavim, it's not saying that's absolutely the pshat of the Breita. It's just saying that's just as reasonable a pshat as what you just said. Both of these are completely reasonable ways to read the Breita. But of course, the problem is that you come to completely opposite conclusions based on each reading, right? So it's important to point that out. It's not saying that this, because if it was true that this was a preferable reading, that would also tell me, then it would tell me that Rabbi Eliezer but Rabbi Shimon is the one who holds that the Avnet of the Kohen Hadiot is boats, right? In other words, if I could be Nistayim, I could have been Nistayim from here, but I can't be. So just for your reference, Tistayim is the beginning of that proposition. When the Gemara comes to a final conclusion, it will often conclude by saying tistaye, right? And it starts tistayem and it ends tistayem. Here there doesn't end tistayem. So we still haven't come to a conclusion. Kiata Ravin, so Ravin, now he comes from Eretz Yisrael. He brings essentially the same tradition that that Rav Dimi brought, except that it's more explicit. Avnei Tosh, he says, Avnei Tosh Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim Divrei Hakol Shel Bots, B'Shar Yomot Hashanah Divrei Hakol Shel Kilayim, right? Divrei Hakol, because obviously the Shnehem Gzerat Katuv. Lo nechleku ela b'avnei Tosh Kohen Hediot bein b'Shar Yomot Hashanah bein b'Yom Kippurim. Sherebi Omer Shel Kilayim. Rabbi Yozar Rabbi Shimon Omer Shel Bots. Right? So he says, Chad Mashma'i, I can tell you who said what. Rebbe was the one who held that the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot was Av Kilayim, and Rabbi Yozar Rabbi Shimon was the one that said the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot was of Bots. Rashi says, Kiata Ravin, he says, Bein Ravin, Bein L'Ravdime, Leka Mide. There is no difference between Ravin and what Ravdimi said. Ela the Ravdimi lo piresh haiminayu the marshal kilayim haiminayu the marshal boats. Ravin piresh behedya. That's the only difference. That Ravin now tells me with confidence who said what. Rebbe Omer shel kilayim. Now I know that it's Rebbe who's the one who said shel kilayim. Amarav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Afa nami tanina al bisaro. So now Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak wants to do what? He wants afa anan nami tanin. So we also learn in a Braita. He wants to bring support for the tradition that said that Rebbe was the one who held that the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot was Shel Kilayim. I learned it from Al Bisaro. Ma Talmud Lamar Yilbash. Lavi mitznef v'avnei ramata deshin divrei Rebbe Yehuda. So Rashi says, Af anan nami tanina, the Rebbe Yehuda Marshal Kilayim, because it says Al Bisaro Gabei Trumata Deshin Ktiv, the Ravash HaKohen Midobad u'Michnesei Bad Yilbash Al Bisaro. V'havelei l'michtav u'Michnesei Bad Al Bisaro. The word Yilbash is superfluous. I know because the beginning of the pasuk said that when the Kohen comes to do Trumat Hadesh, and it says the Vasha Kohen Midobad, he has to put on his white clothing, and he has to wear Michnasayim. So the word Yilbash is superfluous. I could have just said Vasha Kohen Midobad Michnasei Bad, or it could have said Michnasei Bad Al B'saro. But I know he has to wear them because the verb is already at the beginning of the sentence. And so it didn't have to say it. So what does it add by telling me Yilbash? Lavi mitznefet v'avneit. Mishum do ktiv ela midobad. U'v'michtasayim ktiv Yilbash. Lamencha shehi avoda gemura u'tzricha arba'a kelim. Because it only said in the beginning of the pasuk midobad, and if it had only said midobad and not said Yilbash al Basaro from Michnasayim, I might have thought that this isn't truly, that Haramat Hadeshen is not actually an avodah, which would require that the Kohen wears 4 begadim. He could wear the more minimally just the Michnasayim and just the kutonet. But since it says Yilbash is a ribui. It's coming to add it, right? Because it's superfluous, it must be adding something. What did I put here? So that was my comment. Okay. Shira, before I go on, it seems to me that you had a question about that's related to this part of the Gemara here. Should I pull it up, or do you want to say what your question is?
So I guess you must proceed a little bit, and then it's fitting because it's about how can we use this Yibash for first the Gezerah Shabbat to connect it with the Kohen Gadol in Acharei Mot in Pasuk Dalet, and also to prove that we need 4 garments for the full-fledged avodah day for the daily Matadeshin. So
You're right.
I remember that's a little bit of a, you must continue a little bit. So I remember.
You're right. No, but you're right. I do remember. So you're right. Let's just finish because we're almost at the end.
Yeah.
So Rabbi okay, so
After Dosa, we need the position of Dosa and to put it together.
And of Rebbe. Okay, so
Yeah,
Rav Nachman, all right, so Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says we learn in a Breita. So in the Breita, so far, we've only learned the beginning of the Breita, that according to Rebbe Yehuda, the reason that the Torah says Yilbash in Parshat Trumat Hadeshin is to tell me that Trumat Hadeshin, now I'm adding in Rashi's Perush, that Trumat Hadeshin is considered to be fully an avodah. It's a full avodah, and therefore it requires arba begadim for the kohen who does it. And I learned that from the word Yilbash, because without the word Yilbash, I might have thought he could do it with 2 begadim. It just means it's something that has to be done, or it should be done, but it's not, or maybe it's even a mitzvah, but it's not considered to be avodah, because the kohen can only, the kohen, when he does an avodah, must wear his required clothing. Kohen lefi tafkido, right? So if he's a kohen ediot and he's doing avodah, he has to wear the arba begadim. So it's not clear. I actually remember this is also part of one of your questions, which hopefully we'll come back to, which is why was the Torah not clear about this? But okay. It just tangentially reminds me when I was in yeshiva and I was really breaking my teeth on learning Hebrew and Aramaic. I thought, and especially Rashi, in the beginning, Rashi was so hard. And I said, why didn't Rashi write in English so everyone would understand him?
Yeah.
Rabbi Dosa Omer, Lahavi Bigdei Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim. So Rabbi Dosa says no. The reason Yilbash is written there, it's to include the idea that you can use the begadim that the Kohen Gadol used on Yom Kippur, the arba begadim that he used for the avodah of Yom Kippurim, shehen ksherin lekohen hediot. It tells me that now a kohen hediot is allowed to use those clothes for everyday avodah. So this is a big chidush, right? As we'll see, and we discussed this even back when we were learning Acharei Mot, it's not clear to us exactly what happens to the arba begadim of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim once he finishes the last avodah, right? All the Torah says is v'hinicham sham. He leaves them there in the Beit HaMikdash. But now Rabbi Dosa comes and says, yeah, but actually you can use them later. You can use them later, and even a regular Kohen can use them for doing Trumat Hadeshin. So let Rashi explains this a little further. Rabbi Dosa Omer Lahavi Arba'a Bigdei Kohen Gadol Sheshimesh Behem Lifnim B'Yom Kippurim, the 4 begadim that he used when he went inside into the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, Sheksherim Lahediot Kol Yomot HaShana. He can use them all year round. Shelo Tomar V'Hinicham Sham Sheyehu Tu'unin Gniza, that when the Torah says in Parshat Acharei Mot after the last avodah is done by the Kohen Gadol, which is to remove the machta that he brought the Torah into the Beit Kodesh and Kodashim. And it says that he has to remove his clothing and leave them there. So you might have thought that means that now they have to be put into Geniza. And that's what Hin Yicham Sham means. He has to leave them there, meaning they can no longer be used as such. Ella, all it means when it says that you should leave them there, it means that you have to leave them for this avodah at that point. They've left their utility to be used on Yom Kippur at that moment, but they could still be used for other avodah by a Kohen Hadiot. So before we go on to Rebbe, according to Rebbe Dosa, what was the avneit of the Kohen Hadiot? Was it kilayim or was it boats?
It's the same as the Kohen Hidiyot were all year, so it'd be Kalayim.
No. Rabbi Dosa says that we learn that the gadim that the Kohen Gadol used lifnim, right, in the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippurim, can be used by the Kohen Hadiot all year round. So what was the avneit of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim?
Tefillin.
It was Lavan, it was boats. So now I understand that according to Rabbi Dosa, what was the avneit of the Kohen Hadiot?
Tefillin.
It was also pure linen. It was also boats, because he could use the same avneit that the Kohen Gadol used lifnim b'Yom Kippurim. So that's Rabbi Dosa. According to what we've seen before we get to Rabbi Dosa and Rabbi Yehuda is not addressing that question, right? So the Rabbi Yehuda of the Braita, Mal Talmud Lamar Yobash Lavim etc. Avnei Ramat Adeshen. All we know is that he says that the Kohen who does Trumat Adeshen has to also wear an avneit and a mitznefet. He doesn't tell us what the avneit looks like. Rabbi Dosa says, no, Yobash comes to tell me that the clothing that the Kohen Gadol used, especially for Yom Kippurim, the Kohen Hadiot can use all year round. So now I know, Agav, that Rabbi Dosa holds that the avneit of the Kohen Gadol, Yom Kippurim, was boats. That's barur, and therefore the avneit of the Kohen Hadiot was also boats. It was also linen. Rebbe Omer, shtei tshuvot b'davar, right? The two ways of replying to you, right? To challenge you. Chad avneito shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim, lo zehu avneito shel Kohen Hadiot. So right away, the first thing he attacks to against Rabbi Dosa is exactly this point. Even though for Rabbi Dosa, in context, it's kind of a side issue, but Rabbi says it doesn't matter. What you're saying is that the avneit of the Kohen Hadiot was boats, but I'm telling you, the avneit that the Kohen Gadol used on Yom Kippurim, which was boats, that's not the same avneit that the Kohen Hadiot used all year round, which was kilayim. Rashi says, "Avneito shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim lo zehu avneito hakasher lehadiot shaharehu shel boats the Kohen Hadiot kol hayamim dekilayim." So that's the first tshuva of Rebbe to Rebbe Dosa. So here, clearly, Rebbe holds what was the avneit of the Kohen Hadiot made out of?
I'll try again, kalayim.
Correct. Here we see for sure Rebbe holds that the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hedyot was kilayim. And so at this moment, as soon as we see that Rebbe says this, we understand this is why Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak brought the Breita. When he said, Af anan nami tanina, as Rashi said, we also learn in a Breita, the Rebbe who, the Marshal Kilayim, I learn it from this line, Avneto shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim lo zeh Avneto shel Kohen Hedyot. I learn it from there. So this is why Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak brought the entire Breita. It was just for that one line. However, we're still learning. V'od begadim shenishtamshta bahen kedusha chamura tishamesh bahen kedusha kala. And also, is it possible that clothing that had been used for a more stringent kedusha, in this context referring to what? What's the kedusha chamura? What clothing are we talking about?
Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur.
Exactly. And what's the kedusha chamura? Because it was used especially for Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Tishamesh behen kedusha kala. Could you use them for a lighter kedusha of what?
Trumat HaDeshen.
Trumat HaDeshen. Right? That's his second tshuva to Rebbe Dosa. So he has two claims against Rebbe Dosa. One is that he's got the Avneit all wrong. Rebbe Dosa is all wrong about the Avneit. That he holds that the Avneit of the Kohen Hedyot was boats, and Rebbe says no, for sure it was kilayim. But not only that, the whole idea that you're suggesting that the clothing that the Kohen Hedyot used for the holiest day of the year in the Kodesh HaKodeshim could not be used for any other purpose. So he has two tshuvot to Rebbe Dosa. So of course that leaves Rebbe with the question of why does the Torah add this word yilbash? Now before we get to his answer, you might have said, okay, Rebbe just holds like Rebbe Yehuda. It would have been sufficient for Rebbe now to stop. And he could say, I hold like Rebbe Yehuda, and you're all wrong, Rebbe Dosa, and I have two reasons why you're all wrong. But it turns out that Rebbe didn't hold like Rebbe Yehuda, and he didn't hold like Rebbe Dosa. So in fact, according to me, according to Rebbe, why does the Torah say Yilbash? Why does it have that extra word? L'rabot et hashchakim. It comes to include the worn out clothing. So now let's look carefully at Rashi. And I know, Shira, this is part of one of your questions. So this is something I want to read very carefully. Et hashchakim. She'af hashchakim ksherim la'avodah. That worn out clothing is also kosher for a Kohen to do avodah. So first of all, now I see how late it is. But I'll bring you can look in, the Rambam brings down in Hilchot Klei HaMikdash when he talks about the begadim of the Kohen Gadol, and he brings, you can see the sources there. A Kohen Gadol, a Kohen, even a Kohen Hedyot, was not supposed to use worn out clothing. Right, the Gemara learns it out, and it's this idea that in aniyut, right, the makom hashirut, we don't use things that look worn out in the Beit Hamikdash. So the idea, so Rebbe's chidush is a real chidush. It's not obvious that any shchakim can be used for avodah, because l'chatchila you're not supposed to use shchakim for avodah. So Yilbash is a special ribui to tell me specifically for this avodah you could use shchakim. So Rashi at this point, he's going to explain more. That this is enough for us to understand what Rashi is saying. She'af hashchakin ksherim la'avodah. The emphasis here is on the word af. Even shchakim are kosher for avodah. Rashi says, "Va'ani shamati." I heard another perush. Lahavi shchakim dafka. I've heard people want to explain this braita, that when Rebbe says l'rabot et hashchakin, he means that when the Kohen does Trumat Hadeshin, he should dafka use worn out clothing. And why would that be? Mishum bigadim shebishel behen kedera l'rabo lo yimzog behen kos l'rabo. Right, and I gave you the citation where the Gemara uses this. Which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is the analogy that the Gemara uses about the idea of hotza'at hadeshen, that when the deshen was removed, like the big amount of deshen, not trumat, right? We learned this in Tamid, right? There's trumat hadeshen, which is when the first Kohen of the day goes up and scoops up some of the deshen, and then he walks down the ramp and he puts it next to the Mizbeach. But then later on, a bunch of Kohanim go up and they scoop up a whole lot of deshen, and then they take all of it outside of the Beit HaMikdash. So there's Trumat HaDeshen, and what we'll call for this purpose is Hotza'at HaDeshen. So in the context of Hotza'at HaDeshen, the Torah says, the Gemara says, "Begadim shebishel behen kedera rabo lo yimzog behen kos rabo." That just like so what's the mashal and what's the nimshal? That the Kohen who is doing service in the Beit HaMikdash is like a servant before Hashem. But the question is, at any given time, what is his service like in terms of a servant who's, let's say, serving a king? So bigadim should be shel bahen kedera rabo. So the clothing that a servant would use, that the cook of the king would use to cook his meal, to cook his doesn't matter, to cook his meal. No, there's a simple word, and I just can't get it. That's not the clothing he's going to use to go and pour wine for his master, right? So when he's in the kitchen, he's going to be wearing kitchen clothes, and then when he has to go and serve, he has to put on nice clothes. And so in the context of Hotza'at HaDeshen, it means that that the Kohen is going to change clothes to remove the deshen when he takes it out, and that's actually, it's learned out in the Torah, right? Just a second, just to remind us. Because what does it say? ולבש הכהן מדלבד, המכנס עבד יבש הבשרה, והרים את הדשן שטחה על אשת העולה על המזבח, ושמו עץ על המזבח. And then, ופשט את בגדיו ולבש בגדים אחרים. He removes those clothes, and he puts on other clothes. והוציא את הדשן אל מחוץ למחנה אל מקום טהור. Right? So that's a separate act. The idea of taking the deshen outside of the Beit HaMikdash that was a separate action. That's not the mitzvah of Trumat Hadeshin. And the Torah says explicitly that he has to change his clothes to do that second act. Okay, so Rashi is entertaining this possible shot when it says l'rabot et hashchakim. It comes to include the idea. Yobash tells me that a kohen who does Trumat Hadeshin specifically has to wear worn-out clothing because it falls into this metaphor that he's now become like the cook in the kitchen and not the butler serving his master. So Rashi says, "Ve'ni rabeinai." This doesn't look right to me. The bishlama gabe hotzaat hadeshin amrin lekaman hachi mimnei shahabegadim mitbazim umitachachim bahen. So, okay, when we're talking about hotzaat hadeshin, the Gemara says this idea of begadim shebishel bahen kedei ra v'chulei. That's where the Gemara says it. It's about hotzaat hadeshin, and why? The Gemara understands that why did the Torah tell the Kohen that he needs to change his clothes for hotzaat hadeshin? Because that's when his clothes are going to be degraded and get dirty. About Trumat Hadeshin, this first act of simply taking off some of the deshen from the Mizbeach, she'eno ela malo machta leyom, it's just one censer full, each morning. Kedamrina b'masechet Tamid, ein sham lichluch begadim. There's nothing there that will especially get his clothes dirty. So this is Rashi's input. Rashi wants to say the rabot et hashchakim means simply that the word Yobash comes to tell me that the Kohen, when he does Trumat Hadeshin, if he wants, he could wear worn out clothing, but he doesn't have to wear worn out clothing. So that's Rebbe's understanding of the word Yilbash. The main reason we brought it was not for that issue, but it was for this tshuva that he gives to Rebbe Dosa to tell me that the Avnet of the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur, which we know as boats, is not the same as the Avnet of the Kohen Hediot, which now we understand is of Kilayim. But so now the Gemara ends off by saying, so the whole reason we brought this was just for Rebbe and just for that line. But while we brought it, the Gemara makes this comment about Rebbe Dosa. As to Rebbe Dosa l'ta'ameh, Rebbe Dosa goes according to his opinion elsewhere. Titania, we learn in a separate brayta, v'hinicham sham, milamed shetu nin geniza. The Tanakama of the brayta holds that when the Torah tells us that the Kohen Gadol finishes the last avodah that's particular to Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, he has to remove his white clothing and place it there. The Tanakama says it means that those clothes can no longer be used for any other purpose, and they have to therefore be put into Geniza. No, what it really means is that the Kohen, that whoever is Kohen Gadol, whether it's him or whether it's another Kohen Gadol, cannot use those clothes for the next or for any other Yom HaKippurim. Rashi says, Hachi Garsina, this is how we learn. As the Rabbi Dosa Tamei Detanya, Hinicham Sham. Gabe Bigdei Yom HaKippurim Ktiv, right? So this is a pasuk that's talking about the clothing that was worn on Yom Kippur, and where it says, "Upashat et bigdei haba asher lavash bevo'o el hakodesh v'hinicham sham." So let's just understand. Rabbi Dosa really understands v'hinicham sham means that it just means one thing. it means that those clothes cannot again be used for Yom HaKippurim. So how does that tell me that, how is that like, or how does that fit in? That's the word. How does that fit in to what Rabbi Dosa said in the previous Breita? That Yilbash tells me that when a Kohen does Trumat HaDeshen, he's allowed to wear the clothes that the Kohen Gadol wore on Yom HaKippurim. How does this fit into this? As the Gemara says that Rabbi Dosa goes according to his Shita. How is this his Shita? How is what he said in the first Breita the Shita that we see in the second Breita?
When the Kohen Hidiyot uses the used clothing to do Trumat HaDeshen, it's not the Yom Kippur.
Okay. You could say that a little better, but it's late and everybody's tired. So let's just say, exactly. In other words, according to Rabbi Dosa, what we know about the clothing that the Kohen Gadol, the white clothing the Kohen Gadol used on Yom Kippurim, once Yom Kippurim is over, once his Avodah of Yom Kippurim is over, all the Torah tells us is that cannot be used again for Yom HaKippurim. It leaves open the possibility that it could be used for every day. And that's how Rabbi Dosa is the Tameh. So Rabbi Dosa says, actually, no. And so when Rabbi Dosa sees this word Yilbash, so he says, oh, that's what it means. Yilbash is superfluous. It says he has to wear. So what is it that he's going to wear that I would not have otherwise thought he would wear? It tells me, oh, those clothes that the Kohen Gadol used that he could no longer use for Yom Kippurim. Now the Torah tells me a Kohen Hadiot could use them every day. What we don't know, and I think this was either one of your questions or related to one of your questions, is now according to Rabbi Dosa, how do we know that the Kohen who does Trumat HaDeshen needs to wear 4 pieces of clothing? I could actually ask that question according to Rebbe. In other words, according to Rebbe Yehuda, Rebbe Yehuda says the whole reason the Torah tells me Yilbash is because without Yilbash, I would have thought that the Kohen who does Trumat HaDeshen only needs 2 pieces of clothing. Rabbi Dosa says, no, that's not what it means. It means that he can use the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. And Rebbe says, no, that's not what it means. It means that he can use shchakim. So how do Rebbe Dosa and Rebbe know that he needs to use 4 pieces of clothing at all? So that the Gemara doesn't address. And because it's really late, and this went much longer than I thought, I'm going to leave that. And I'm going to leave the rest of what you brought up, but I think that by going through it carefully, I think I did help to clarify some of the things you brought up in some of your other questions. But I will not, just as a final word, I will just say something which I think is very interesting, and it's also related to what we might say is a more conceptual aspect of what's going on. It comes out really interesting that now Rabbi Dosa says that the clothing that had been used, arguably for the most holy possible purpose that clothing could be used in the Beit HaMikdash, can now be used for Trumat HaDeshen by any Kohen. So I'm taking these very special and, the way Chazal understood also, extremely expensive clothes, and I'm going to use them for not necessarily, as Rashi points out, such a dirty avodah, but just a plain, simple avodah. So it goes really mikatzeh katzeh. It goes from the Kodesh HaKodashim to the outer Mizbeach. And Rebbe says, no. You can't do that. It's punkt verkehrt. Trumat Hadeshen, which is a simple avodah. The whole point of what the Torah is trying to tell me is not that you should use the most special clothes of the Kohen Gadol. Lehefech, you can use worn out clothing. You can use just the opposite of that. And so it lays a groundwork for what we could understand to be conceptual differences between Rabbi Dosa and Rebbe, how they viewed the avodah of Trumat Hadeshen, how they viewed clothing that had been used for a holy purpose or not. There's a lot here, but I'll leave it at that. So before I finish, Shira, did you want to say anything now before we end? Or do you want, or if you want, you can leave it for next time. But if you want to say something now, it's okay.
So only the question of the levels of kedusha. So we could we also say that Reb and not Rebbe, that Dosa doesn't depend the question of kedusha on the garment. So he disconnected perhaps, or the other position is to not to combine, but to kind of connecting between garments and levels of kedusha. So Dosa is perhaps in the position to say, oh no, the question whether our levels of kedusha is not depending on which kind of garments the priests are wearing, perhaps. Oh, that's another aspect. I think about.
Okay, if I understand what you're saying, I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently. So Rebbe said to Rebbe Dosa, it's to put it not as a rhetorical question, but to put it as a statement. It's not seemly to use garments that were used for a kedusha chamura to use them for a kedusha kala. So the way Rebbe makes that claim is that the kedusha was the act. Kedusha chamura. They were used in the act of doing a kedusha chamura. He's not, because you could also, again, you could say that Rebbe would hold if for some reason the begadim of the bigdei lavan of the Kohen Gadol were not used on Yom Kippur for whatever reason. It could be that he might hold that yes, then a Kohen Hadyot could wear them except for the Avnet, right? He could wear the other ones because they were not used for a kedusha chamura. So his emphasis is on the fact that they were used for a kedusha chamura, and now you want to use them for a kedusha kala. So yeah, that's inherent. That's his claim against Rabbi Dosa. So yes, now we're curious. What would Rabbi Dosa reply to Rebbe? Maybe he would say, it doesn't matter, because that's how I understand the pasuk of Yilbash. To me, that's the whole chidush of Yilbash, and I'm going to connect it to the way I understand V'hinicham Sham, that once these clothes have been used for Yom Kippurim, for halachic purposes now, they revert to just regular clothes. That's hinicham sham. You've left them there. Now they've reverted to regular clothes. Presumably, that would be something like the way he would answer him. Okay. I'll try to tie up a few loose ends next time, but basically next time we're going to look at we'll look at the sugya based on the Mishnah on Lamed Hey Amud Bet, which is where it talks about the first vidui of the Kohen Gadol, and we're going to do the sugya there. We'll probably skip the very first part, or else we'll go through it quickly. We're going to start doing it from the time it talks about how he did the smicha, and then the main thing that we want to talk about is the nisuach of the vidui. There's a machoket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about the order of what you say, aviti pashati chatati, or do you say chatati aviti pashati? So that's the main thing we're going to look at. So thank you, everybody. Much longer than I thought. I hope this was okay. This was like a very careful reading of the Gemaras. I hope this is okay. I'd be happy to do this every week, but I don't know if everybody's as into it as I am. Take it easy.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.